as the facilitator. I have a very simple role tonight, and that is to facilitate this meeting. And then as a resident of Bronzeville, as a parent of children that go to school in Bronzeville, and as a community leader here in Bronzeville, I'm here to not only facilitate, but also to get educated. There are so many things that I am not aware of. And when it comes to these kinds of meetings, I come to this kind of meeting just like you have to be educated. And I think these kinds of meetings give us that opportunity to learn just a little bit more. So in order for that to happen, we have to respect one another's voice. We have to respect each other's input and make sure that we respect the agenda, because there's a certain time allotted for us to actually have this conversation. And so we have created an agenda where not only will we hear from the representative, not only will we hear from political officials and a couple of educators and community members, but we also get a chance to hear from the entire community. So there's a segment that I am going to be sure to make sure that we open up so that we can hear from the community. Because here's what I firmly believe. It doesn't matter who is in political office, we cannot hold them accountable if they don't hear from us. Can I get an amen right there? They shouldn't have a meeting where they talk to us or talk at us without them having an opportunity to hear from us. And so I'm excited about this agenda tonight, because we're going to make sure that that happens. I had the privilege of being the chairman of the Bronzeville Community Action Council for about 2 years, and we did our best to make sure that not only did we hear from others, but we made sure others hear from us. So that same thing will happen tonight. So after we checked our phones, we respect one another's voice, let's make sure we leave educated, so that those who could not be here tonight, we make sure we go back and convey to the other constituents what exactly happened in here tonight. So we really do need your help with that. And even if you are knowledgeable, the person next to you may not be knowledgeable. So make sure you give them an opportunity to hear all of the information that is going to be shared, so that we all will be able to leave out of here educated. Now, the last thing that I'll say is, we said that we are on television. And when you have in our community, I just saw on the news the other day, on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, they were talking about the Bronzeville community and talking about some of the negative things that are happening in Bronzeville. But can I just get somebody to clap for the fact that everything in Bronzeville that's happening is not negative? Everything happening in Bronzeville is not negative. And so being on television tonight allows them to see that there is a community that is willing and ready to be involved with this conversation, especially around education. So I'm so glad to have all of you all here. To move us further and to welcome us, would you clap your hands for the CEO of the Chicago Urban League, Andy Zopp.
Thank you, Reverend Harris. I am really thrilled to see all of you here tonight for this very, very important conversation. The Urban League has been focused on schools and education for a long time, and we've been focused specifically on the topic of school funding for also for a very long time. As many of you know, the Urban League filed a lawsuit against the state of Illinois and the State Board of Education in 2008, 6 years ago, challenging the way that we fund schools in Illinois as discriminatory. That lawsuit is still pending. We're still fighting it. We've uncovered significant evidence that, in fact, what we alleged is true, that the way that we fund schools in Illinois not only has a disparate impact because we fund it based on property taxes, which means that those school districts that have the least property values, which are the poorest school districts, get less money to supplement what the state contributes. That's really important in Illinois, because in Illinois, the state contributes the least, amongst the least amount of money to education of states in the country. We're at the bottom of the list in terms of what the state contributes. And then what happens is that local districts have to make up the rest. And they make up the rest based on property taxes. And if your property values are low, you don't have the money to contribute. So as a result, we have disparate impact of funding in Illinois, which evidence shows results in poor results for our children, particularly children of color. So the way we currently fund schools in Illinois is unconstitutional, we believe. we believe we will win our lawsuit, which means we need to change the way that we fund schools in Illinois. So that's what this discussion is about. And everything that Pastor Harris says about keeping an open mind, about listening, is really important. Because when you're you're pushing for real change, it can be really scary. Because there's always people there's always going to be impacts to that. And you'll have people, you want to avoid trying to get in a conversation where people are saying, you know what, if we change the way we fund schools, our schools will get less, your schools will get more. Their schools will get more, our schools will get less. The important thing is that we will be funding schools based on the way we need to fund schools, based on need. That's what SB 16, which we're going to be talking about tonight, does. That's a better, more progressive way to fund schools, and in the long run, not in the short run when we first change it, but in the long run will be better for all of our students. That's what we believe, but we're going to have a conversation about that tonight. The fact that you're here means that it's something that you care about. I hope you'll come with open minds, and we hope that you'll think about joining the coalition to change the way that we fund our schools so that we can have a system that is progressive, not regressive. Thank you all for coming. Thanks particularly to our elected officials for being here, who have so many things on their time but are here because they care about what we're doing and want to make a difference, and I appreciate it. Thanks to all of you, this is exactly what the Urban League should be doing, and we're happy to see you here, so thank you. And turn it over back to Pastor Harris.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And so why are all of us here? We're here because we all care about education and about the future of young people in our community. Again, I went to Woodson School, attended at some point in my life Overton School, my sisters and brothers, went to Dunbar and King, and we care about the schools, and that's why you're here tonight. And so tonight should not be a waste of any of our time. We should leave informed and we should leave inspired, but most of all, once we leave, we should become much more involved, and that's what it's all about. As I was doing work with the Bronzeville Community Action Council, we had many hurdles, and we had to go through a whole lot of hoops and challenges as it relates to how we can make schools better in the Bronzeville community. And the present chair and many of the members of the Bronzeville Community Action Council are actually here present tonight, and they're still working, meeting on a monthly basis to figure out what more we can do to bring resources not only to our schools, but also to bring fairness and justice and funding programs that will curb violence. And when we have these conversations tonight, that's what enables us to be able to do that. With that said, I am excited to bring our representative of the 26th District, who will give us, for lack of a better term, the current state of educational funding crisis and SB 16. Would you clap your hands for the representative of the 26th District, Christian Mitchell.
Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you all for being here. I know it is a Monday evening. Y'all probably want to see the Cowboys play anyway, but if you did, you chose to be here instead, and I really, really appreciate it. I'm going to start off a bit by talking about why this is so important to me, why this matters, and what this bill is and is not. Everybody hear me? Okay. My being here is actually, it was pretty uncertain growing up. I grew up split between Maywood and Westchester. We were the second black family in Westchester, but my grandparents lived in Maywood, which is where I stay while my mother worked the night shift. And what I remember is that in Maywood, things were a whole heck of a lot different. My mother worked the night shift that time to help put me through the best school she possibly could, and I ended up going on to St. Joseph High School and the University of Chicago. But there was a kid across the street from me. Don't want to use his name because he's actually sort of around here now, who was smarter than I was, better looking than I was. I know it's hard to believe. No, I'm just kidding. And better at sports, better in every way than I was. But the difference was I had a mother who had a solid and steady job, and His parents were split, and he was taking care of his brothers and sisters growing up, and he went to a public school in Maywood, and I went to a private school in Westchester. I'm a state representative, and last I heard, he was in jail. That's the only difference, is the opportunity that I had, because education should be the great equalizer. I didn't time this, but the New York Times did a op-ed on, I want to say it was Sunday, and I just want to read a few passages from it. It is by Nick Kristof. The best escalated opportunity in America is education, but a new study underscores that that escalator is broken. A new Pew survey finds that Americans consider the greatest threat to our country to be the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Yet we have constructed an education system dependent on local property taxes that provides great schools for the rich kids in the suburbs who need the least help, and broken, dangerous schools for inner city children and rural children who desperately need a helping hand. Too often, Americans' education system amplifies not opportunity, but inequality. And for too many of us in this room, for too many of the people that we've worked with, the communities that we serve, that remains true to this day. What I want to talk about is what SB 16 is and isn't, and how it helps us get to a better place as a city, as a state, as a country. Right now, Illinois ranks, I want to say, 49th in adequacy and 48th in equity. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between equity and adequacy and what this bill does and does not address. But right now, our share of education funding as a state is basically criminal. As Andy Zopp said, that's the reason they're suing, because it's effectively criminal. So I kind of gave this outline already. We're going to talk about what's wrong with funding in Illinois, what does this bill do to help, what would its impact be, and what can we do as people and as part of this coalition to move us forward. So here's where we are right now. We have lost $1.4 billion in education funding since 2009. I use the word lost deliberately. This figure's been politicized in the latest governor's race to say that, you know, the current governor cut all that money. Well, much of that was one-time stimulus funding that went away. But what is true is that since fiscal year 2000, we've lost about 10% of our education funding in the state of Illinois. In an era where you earn what you learn, that is unacceptable. Here's what's important. Here's why this equity gap is such a problem. So here's where we are. We're the light blue bar. This is the top bar of the most progressive states in the nation. So for example, Massachusetts, which this bill is based off of, is in this range. They spend about 128%, or they spend basically 28% more on their poorest students. On the other hand, Illinois spends about 25% less, for a gap of about 40%. So literally the kids who most need the education dollars are less likely to get it in the state of Illinois. That's where we are right now. So there's been a lot of talk about adequacy and equity, and much of the criticism about this bill from a lot of folks is about the fact that it doesn't address the adequacy piece. The fact that our foundation level is 6119 and our own state board of education says we should actually be at about 8600. That is a fair point, but here's the issue. Trying to fix adequacy before fixing equity would make you, I hate to steal from my pastors here, but a lot like the foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And the reason why is because if you think of, I think of education funding almost like a bucket. And if a bucket's got a bunch of holes in it, if you got a high-powered fire hose, you can get that bucket full eventually. But it's going to take a lot more water. If you fix the holes first so that you make sure that money is going toward those kids who need it the most, you get to a situation where the revenue needed, whether it be through a progressive income tax or a financial transaction tax or expanding the sales tax base or closing corporate loopholes, that amount of money necessary to get us to adequacy goes down based on fixing the equity problem first. You're fixing the structure of your house before doing add-ons. That's what this bill's about. And why equity is so important is emphasized by this slide. So right now, we say our foundation level is supposed to be this, 6119. But we're actually only funding about 89% of that, which is about $5,700. The problem is that's an across-the-board cut, and as the next slide and slides after will demonstrate, that hits poorer districts harder because they rely on general state aid, which is state funding, our most progressive funding formula, for the majority of their funding. So right now, when we prorate, when we cut that 11% off the top, it has an impact of that is 5 times greater on the poorest students as compared to those students who can most afford to pay. In CPS, it's about 4 times. So right now, there are winners and losers in education funding every year. Because a lot of people are saying, well, let's keep the status quo, let's put more money in it, let's figure out how we do it. Well, if we do that, every year we do and we underfund education, we are hurting poor kids more than we're hurting anybody else. Here's a perfect example. So on the left here, you have Rockford, which is a higher poverty district. On the right, you have New Trier. What you'll hear from a lot of my Republican colleagues is, well, if you've got an issue with ed funding, you should increase your property tax levy and fund it locally the way that we do. Don't try to take away our fair share of state resources. Well, if you look, general state aid is about $1 in $4 in Rockford. It is $1 in $100 in New Trier. But let's look at their tax rates for a second, because you heard what my Republican colleagues would say. The tax rate in Rockford is 5%. The tax rate in New Trier is lower, 3%. There was a report that codified that this is in fact the case across the board, effectively due to the impact of district wealth. So the idea that where you're born, the place you're born, if you're born with higher property wealth, you get to go to a better school and you're going to increase the cycle. Or if you're in a lower, a district with lower property taxes, you will not get a great education and find yourself in that loop, is codified. And you in fact have to tax less to get more money based on property value, which makes sure that where you're born determines your shot at a good education. That's the system right now as it is. So this is just a further example. I'm not going to go through all these, but on the left you have districts that are higher poverty. On the right you have districts that are lower poverty. And if you look at their tax rate, East St. Louis could tax itself all it wanted to and it would never get to adequacy. They don't have the tax base. Lake Forest, on the other hand, they have extremely low rates, but because their property values are so high, their kids get a better shot. So, enter Senate Bill 16. So originally it started as a Senate resolution and a House resolution, put together a Senate Funding Advisory Committee, and the goal of it was to say, and I'm going to explain this in a couple of slides, let's, instead of taking all these random streams of funding, you got the PTEL grant, the flat grant, the poverty grant, all these different pieces, only about 45% of which is subject to progressivity, to poverty, to need. Let's take all that, put it in one formula, and then all of a sudden, instead of 44% of funding being distributed based on actual need, we get to about 90%. So we're spending our state dollars better. So here's an illustration of this, because I need pictures for this stuff sometimes. So the base amount is right here. That's based on the current foundation level. So one of the questions I often get asked is, well, does this put new money into the system? The answer is it does not. But what it does do is say, let's distribute the monies that we have more efficiently, and let's fix it so that as we increase revenues, more money goes more to the students who need it the most. So additional student needs, poverty, special education, English language learners. What it would say is, if you're a district with lower levels of property wealth, you would get additional funding from the state. The state would do more to cover your share. If you're a district that's a little more fortunate, that's great, but you are going to pay more, and we're going to make sure we take into account your ability to pay in a way that we haven't for a long time. So this is just another illustration of that, and effectively, this district property wealth, it's equalized assessed value, and it'll become important when I talk a bit about CPS. That is the district's ability to pay, and it is only a mandated factor in general state aid, which is that 45% I talked about, as opposed to how we do supplemental grants like poverty or the flat grant, as opposed to other categoricals like transportation or the block grant or early childhood education. So effectively, that's just an illustration of what I just said. Instead of these, several different categories, all of a sudden it goes in so that the only categoricals remaining here are significantly lower, so that most of the money goes directly into a formula that will weight progressively based on factors that we're going to talk about on the next slide. So, we know from all the research that poverty is the #1 driving factor in educational outcomes. Everyone knows that. So what we're going to say now is, let's give additional weight per student based on concentration of poverty. We'll talk about that a bit on the next slide, but let's go 75% above what a student is currently getting based on their need for poverty if they're in concentrated poverty. So 30% and up, we start to weight in a way that takes into account the needs of the student in a very different way. For special education, I had a couple questions on this when I addressed the Hyde Park CAC. It assumes that you've got about 14% of your students who are special needs, which is the state average. That wasn't something that was just plucked out of thin air. If you have more than that, need exceptional levels of service, there is a process by which you can seek additional funding. So it's going to maintain those levels, and over time, we'll start to increase them. ESL, there's even a bit of a grant for gifted students, AP courses, and for our rural brothers and sisters, there is a consideration of the fact that getting to the schoolhouse takes a little more time, takes more energy. So how do we make sure that they have resources based on those needs? Part of what we run into when we try to do things for Chicago is when we don't include downstate, we find ourselves in a situation where we don't have the votes to get done what needs to be done. This is an example of saying we understand that many of your needs are similar to ours if manifested differently, and we have to make sure that you're accommodated as we move forward. So this is the really exciting part on the poverty concentration. So let's take CPS, for example, which kind of hovers in this range. So this is the current formula. It's a poverty grant that sort of scales based on need, but not really, and is a more gradual curve as opposed to the spike you see in terms of concentration of poverty. So right now, under SB 16, you would see CPS students getting an additional, this gap right here is about $2,000 per student. To illustrate what that means, if you look at, say, Revis Elementary in my district, which has about 300 students, all of whom kind of fall into that category, you're talking about an additional about $615,000 Revis might have had this year if we had a system like this in place. When you need a new math lab, a new science lab, when you're talking about additional resources to prevent consolidation or more for early childhood education or all those sorts of things, that kind of money could be a game changer for our system. And by the way, I've heard criticism about whether or not the poverty weight is high enough, and I'd love to do even more. But understand that if this bill passed, the poverty concentration amount would be the highest in the nation. That is higher than Massachusetts, which is currently the most progressive. It would be the highest weight in the country when we get this done. So we've heard the conversation kind of about winners and losers. I don't like that term because, as I noted on proration, there are winners and there are losers every single year based on the current system. And the losers, for the most part, are almost always poor kids. Because when we prorate and take that money off the top, it is a bigger share of their income or of their school dollars as opposed to some of the higher wealth districts. So downstate wins, suburbs, south suburbs win, which is, I'm sure, important to my colleague, Representative Davis. Large high poverty districts all over see a boost. Now, for example, some of my Republican colleagues who represent New Trier, et cetera, will cry that they lose 70% of their funding. Well, remember the New Trier pie graph I showed before. General state aid was 1% of their funding. So they're going to lose 70% of their 1%. And what we have right now is a system where you've got a bunch of districts that are trying to choose, well, can we have a math teacher? Can we have an art teacher? Can we have a computer lab? And you've got other districts that are like, do we want one Olympic-sized swimming pool or two? And I'm not begrudging your swimming pool. I swam, I love swimming, but you're talking about necessities versus luxuries. And this formula helps us get to a point where we prioritize the necessities first. So the question I've heard is about CPS. Some people say, well, I hear they're going to lose some money, $40 million or 0.5%. It's not accurate. And the reason why it's not accurate is the ISB projections use numbers that are outdated. We have increased funding as a state by about $400 million, and they didn't kind of take into account funding or the changing of the equalized assessed value. That's the property value. So Chicago's property value is going down relative to the rest of the state. That alone is going to mean that we would see an increase under this formula of millions of dollars. But you add in that extra funding, and that number goes up even higher. But put the numbers aside for a second, because we could argue and bicker about those all day. Here's the point. We win big over time. As we start to put more funding into the system, as we start to see our income tax receipts recover, as we get other revenue mechanisms that go into general state aid, we are now accounting for need. We're accounting for poverty. We're accounting for ESL. We're accounting for special education in a different way, in a way that CPS wins over time. That is what is key about this. So we're going to talk more about next steps kind of later after we hear from some of our other elected officials and some testimony and some questions. The Senate has already passed the bill, thanks to the leadership of Senator Raul and Senator Biss and Senator Menard and others, Senator Menard being the sponsor. The House it has a work group that's working on it now, which Representative Davis is on and will talk about a little bit. And we are likely trying to move toward getting this bill called sometime in the January lame duck session. That's why we're working so hard on it. There is not a single more transformative issue for the state of Illinois than this issue right here. I am extremely proud to work on it. We got a lot of state reps here, so we're all going to hear how important it is, but if your state rep isn't in this room, we're going to want you to talk to them as well. So we'll talk about all that a little bit later. We are going to have some additional discussion. I'm going to turn it back over to Pastor Harris, and then we'll move toward Q&A and other things. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Christian. And I think one of the things that we always have to keep in mind is we are all being educated, and I learned some things that I did not know. How many of you all just in that short presentation learned something that you did not know? Raise your hand. Look at the room. And that's why it's so important that we be here and be attentive and hear clearly, because whatever happens and whatever does not happen, all of us in this room should be and will be held accountable as it relates to what we could have done. And so my hope is, as we leave here later on, we will leave with a very clear, concise, and very specific call to action for all of us. I share with you that my siblings went to schools here, but this is generational as well for me, because my mother went to Phillips High School, and so we've been here all of our lives, and this is very important. So whatever they faced and whatever they had, whatever the generations during my time had or did not have, we need to be making sure that the generations to come will have better opportunities than all of us did. And if you agree with that, clap your hands in this room. So we come to fight for better opportunities for the generations to come. We're glad to fill this table with a panel of individuals who will have the responsibility of educating us the more and taking us further into robust discussion. The first person, Pastor Mike Russell, as he comes. Would you come on? Pastor Mike Russell is here with us. Angelique Harris, who is the chairman of the Bronzeville Community Action Council. We also have Representative Ken Duncan, who is the representative for the 5th District. We also have coming Representative Will Davis, who is representing the 30th District. Is Senator Raul, did he make it? Okay. And Alderman Will Burns of the 4th Ward. Would you clap your hands for all of these panel members that are here tonight? Can you take a moment and Representative Ken Duncan, since you always like to be a preacher, would you test the microphone for us? Just want to make sure everybody can
Testing.
Everybody can hear in the back? All right, great. We just want to make sure that everybody is able to hear. And I would encourage all of you all, take this moment, get a pen and paper and write down your questions, because after this panel discussion, we're going to open the floor for questions. And again, because we have a very limited amount of time, we want to maximize the time tonight. And so prepare your questions as you're hearing from all of these individuals, as well as we will hear also and point some questions toward Christian Mitchell. And we'll start tonight with Pastor Mike Russell, and then he'll pass the baton over to Angelique Harris. Why is tonight so important, and what should all of our takeaway be from tonight? What do you know, and what should we know?
I am the
president of an organization called SOUL, Southsiders Organizing for Unity and Liberation. We have been fighting this fight for 2 decades. We have been struggling to increase funding for education in Illinois. The movement from 48th to 49th has been pretty much blank. We have not moved in 20 years in terms of our commitment to educational funding. And we have fought this battle to the extent where our children have suffered over 2 decades of their opportunities just being, just deteriorating with underneath them. And this bill is one of the first real breakthroughs, considering that it's already been passed, one of the first real breakthroughs that we have towards moving towards an equity-based funding situation, which is absolutely essential before we talk about the way to address the overall inequalities, not just in education, but inequalities in opportunities for jobs, equalities in opportunities for housing, inequalities in opportunities for advancement. That's why I'm here, that's why this is so important, and that's why I'm proud to be among these people who are standing on the front line of the fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Angelique Harris, you are the present chairman of the Bronzeville Community Action Council. And let me just take a point of privilege. I'm proud to see you here tonight. She was in the hospital and the Lord allowed her to come on out, and she is here tonight. I think we ought to give her a hand for pressing her way to be here with us tonight. You understand what he said. It's not moved in 20 years. These are rather serious challenges. What's the role of the community? What is our responsibility? What is our call to action and how we should get involved?
Well, when the CAC first started about 4 years ago, you insisted that we take the time of 1 year to learn everything we could about education and everything we could about the inequities in our community. As we look at the importance of the things that we've asked for this year as far as quality early childhood education, libraries in every school, social and emotional learning, we found that most schools cut that through lack of funding. Those are important in order for our kids to excel. Those are very important in order for them to be successful. There's not a college in Chicago without a library, but why does our elementary schools don't have libraries? So that's important to us. And we found that in order to ask for resources, resources need funding. So when State Rep. Christian Mitchell came to us with this opportunity, we can only support that because we know that to be the truth. We know that our kids are coming in knowing less words than their counterparts. We know that as a fact. We know that our schools have to have security, and they have to take funding for security for safe, conducive climates. So in order for that to happen, we need to back any opportunity for funding. And I'm going to use an analogy that everybody in this city knows. Right now, we have our principals driving on pothole streets because they have to go through all this bumpy road because they have to choose between arts, science, math, and reading, and the best teachers and quality education. They shouldn't have to do that. And we have an opportunity here, if we know we have a deficit in our community, to take charge of this and make sure that this goes through so that we can give our kids the best opportunities. That's what we've learned, and we back this as a CAC 100% because we know that the funding, and to ask for resources, we need to ask for funding. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. So we have, that's right. So we've heard from a preacher. We've heard not only from the chairman of the Bronzeville Community Action Council, but you're also a parent. But then we have to hear from the politician. And I just believe this from my experience and all that I've seen and known. I believe this. There are some politicians, if the community say nothing, they will do nothing. And amen fits right there. And I think we have a responsibility to hold our political officials accountable and hear from them, but also share with them what our thoughts are. And it's their job to represent the voice of the community. So with that said, the alderman of the 4th Ward, Will Burns, we've heard about this coalition. We've heard about 20 years of work being done. Tell us a little bit more about that work and what our responsibility is in response to your responsibility.
So let me begin by thanking Representative Mitchell for putting this town hall on. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague, Alderman Pat Dow. We're in the 3rd Ward, and I want to acknowledge her for her great leadership here in Bronzeville. Here's the bottom line. For the past 50 years, folks in Illinois have tried to change the way we fund public schools. Most of that was around the reliance on the property tax as the primary source for how we fund our public schools. And there was some significant progress made in the 1970s where the state was a significant contributor to our schools, and that as states faced problems, Illinois began retrenching. In the late 1990s, there was an attempt, House Bill 452, many of you may remember that, where there was new revenue found for public schools, there was an increase in the foundation level, there were other guarantees and promises made. But the state lost focus, and people have fought over the last 20 years to A, change the revenue sources for public schools, but also to make sure that when you have the new money, you don't get away from the point of the state's involvement in public education, which is to take resources collected at the state level and direct them to the poorest school districts in the state, to make sure that those communities have the resources to provide an adequate education. And what my friend Representative Mitchell didn't mention is that over the last 20 years, even when we were fighting for more money for public schools, there was also a systematic effort to divert those revenue dollars to school districts that didn't need those dollars through the categorical program. He glossed over it, and if you'll just give me 2 more minutes, Pastor, I appreciate it. I'll close 3 times, I promise.
Preachers close 3 times, not politicians.
So we have the general state aid formula, which is about schools that are poor. But many of the categorical programs were designed to give money to the wealthiest school districts. And so when you see a slide up there that shows the amount of money that's in categorical programs now going into the school aid formula, what you are seeing is a massive redistribution of wealth. What you are seeing is a massive redistribution of wealth to the communities that need those resources the most. It is the most courageous piece of legislation I've seen in Springfield since my colleague sitting to my right, Will Davis, who was my seatmate down in Springfield, was working on House Bill 174 with Senator Meeks and a bunch of other people to raise new revenue for public schools. We still need more revenue, let me be clear. But it doesn't do you a bit of good to have more revenue if you're putting it into a system that doesn't direct it where it needs to go. So this is a very important step. I want to congratulate Representative Mitchell for his work. Last thing is that you all have to be involved in this. You have to talk to your friends and neighbors and say, this is a way that we make our schools better. And so we all need your support on this. Thank you, Pastor.
Thanks so much. So, to Representative Ken Duncan, why would something like this be important to the entire Black Legislative Caucus, both here in the city as well as throughout the entire state?
So why would it be?
Yeah.
Well, it's critical because most of the districts that we represent, can everyone see me back there way in the back? Because I can't see you. I have a small head, so you should this is critical for the Black community or any poor community in this state. When you look at, if you have ever been to East St. Louis, to Rockford, to Peoria, certain parts of it, not all of it, you'll see abject poverty in Decatur, in Pembroke. You also see about 800 plus school districts in the 102 counties that we have here. That's a lot of school districts. That's a lot of folks jockeying for a very small amount of resources here in our state. Having listened to what Christian Mitchell talked about and our aldermen and our good community leaders and presidents and what some of you all will articulate is that, or what's not talked about is, we don't have the political courage downstate in Springfield to do the right thing when it comes to putting dollars in education. We talk about it when we're running for office and when we're in office, but when it comes to really cutting that pie up, it's a matter of no. I know who they're talking about in Rockford. I know who they're talking about in East St. Louis and the Chicago public school system. Now, this bill is revenue neutral. We need to talk about revenue, and our good chairman of appropriations for elementary and secondary education is going to address that. But this is going to really cut to the core of who we are as legislators, whether we're from Chicago, whether we're from the Naperville suburb, or we're downstate in Illinois. When you start chopping up that cash and educating everyone, including black folk and brown folk, that's when you start seeing a lot of the political dancing and nuances of that level of dialogue and conversation. It's always a no. 20 years is ridiculous to talk about educating our babies. And so watch this fight. Watch it very keenly. But I would also lend to you that you'll probably get about 90+% of all of us in the Black Caucus in the House and Senate supporting anything that's going to change or add funding to our respective schools. You're going to have to work on the downstaters. You're going to have to build a relationship with someone that you know downstate in Macoupin County and Pike County on how it is that they're going to support what it is that we do, that they've talked about equal school funding. But they don't want you to cut into their chop. So you'll be emailing and calling us, but you're going to have to work with us as we try to work our colleagues downstate, Reverend. So the great equalizer is access to education and information. So thank you.
Thanks so much. So to Representative Will Davis, as we understand, who represents the 30th district, of course, we understand that this bill has already passed the Senate, and there's some momentum building behind the bill in the House, and that's why it's important that we get involved. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what's going on from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Pastor. Good evening, everyone. As was stated, I'm Will Davis. I represent the 30th district, which is actually completely in the south suburbs. Anybody from the south suburbs in the room tonight? One other person. How about that?
Two.
All right, two people.
Okay,
right.
I saw three in the back.
Part of the reason that I make specific mention of that is sometimes these conversations get caught up in Chicago versus the rest of the state. This is one conversation that should not get caught up in that conversation. This is about funding for the entire state of Illinois. As an appropriations chair, and actually what I guess I realized is that between myself and Ken, we are the appropriations chairs from birth all the way through college. He's higher education, I'm K through 12 education. And this conversation is about that across the state of Illinois. I don't have the luxury of just focusing in on my district. I don't have the luxury of just focusing in on black or brown kids. I'm the appropriations chairperson for the entire state of Illinois. So it's a very broad conversation that we are trying to have here, but more importantly, we are trying to impact funding in poor communities, and not all poor communities in the state of Illinois are black and brown. But we certainly want to make sure that we are focusing particularly on those communities as well, and what we do for those communities has an impact all across the entire state of Illinois. So again, I want to thank my colleague, Representative Mitchell, for inviting me to this forum, giving me an opportunity to hear from a different constituency that I may not have the opportunity to hear from, and we certainly hope that there will be substantive feedback coming from you about this bill in its current form and some of the challenges with the bill moving forward. So Christian, in his slide, talked about how the bill has passed the Senate. And speaking of Senate, I want to make sure we acknowledge our colleague from the Senate, Senator Jackie Collins, who joined us this evening as well. So it passed the Senate, now it's in the House. Well, the House is taking a very good look at the bill. One of the things that I am participating in is that the Democrats in the House decided to put together a work group to examine this bill. And we have been holding meetings, not hearings, but meetings all summer, talking to various constituent groups about different pieces of the bill. Christian pointed out conversations about low-income students and concentrations of low-income students. He pointed out specific conversations about special special education. We heard today a specific conversation from the Latino Policy Forum about English language learners and how they fare in this. So there are a lot of different conversations taking place about this bill. One thing that I can probably assure you is that the bill that passed out of the Senate will not be the same version that will pass out of the House. Again, we are taking all of this into consideration. One of the things that we recognize, and while his slide talked about the South suburbs being overall +3 on it, and what we recognize is that there are anomalies in this bill. Like, for instance, Proviso. One of the school districts that has probably one of the highest concentrations of poverty, probably needs a significant amount of resources. Well, in the current calculations, they actually come out a loser in this bill. And I point that out because we are trying to recognize the challenges of the bill where we see districts like Proviso in the western suburbs, Thornton, which was on his slide, in the south suburbs, particularly District 205, you know, some of those districts don't come out on the plus side of this. So we are taking a look, and that's the purpose why we have the House work group, is so that we can take conversation and information about some of these subtle nuances in the bill to see if we can craft a bill that we can pass in both chambers. Now, the politics, as Ken alluded to, and it was alluded to earlier, is that unfortunately there are going to be some people who are not happy with this bill. I know what our objective is to try to create a better funding system of dollars that we currently have. And there's another piece to that conversation that was mentioned earlier. So while the bill seeks to take what we currently have and redistribute it a little bit better, we know that there's also an adequacy conversation that needs to go along with this as well, where we're talking about raising additional revenue. Christian alluded to that. With regard to talking about closing corporate loopholes, taxes, which I know is a conversation that nobody really likes, but again, from my perspective, when I take a step back and look at hopefully what we're trying to accomplish for school children in the state of Illinois, it becomes a very broad conversation versus narrowing in on one specific piece of it. Again, when I looked at that chart graph where he said that there are wealthy school districts who 1% of their funding is state funding. Again, they're losing 70% of 1% of all the money that they put forward versus other school districts where the general state aid, which is the state funding, makes up a more significant portion of the dollars that they receive. So again, we are trying to shift the balance of funding in the state of Illinois. It is a multi-layered conversation because again, while we're talking about Senate Bill 16, there's also a need for revenue, so that's another conversation that needs to be had. There are some distinctions, and as a matter of fact, I have a document that someone passed out that talked about, you know, challenges with the city of Chicago. Well, to think that we're not trying to take into consideration those challenges would be a false number. We are trying to take into consideration the challenges of the city of Chicago. We understand that that is where they're the largest school district in the state of Illinois, but they have some of the highest concentrations of the poverty that we're trying to address. You know, I could say, because I'm a South Suburban rep, that when you look at the city of Chicago by itself, I can see issues with the way the city of Chicago distributes the money that it gets. And that's a conversation as well that we need to also be having, but not separate and apart from one another. It's one collective conversation that we all need to be having. And I won't take 3 times to close, but one of the main purposes of this bill, ladies and gentlemen, is to challenge the status quo. There are some people that would prefer that we just leave it alone. If we leave it alone, we know that many of our school districts are already losing. So we're not talking about the fact that they're already losing. We're just looking at the fact that if we change it now, that some of the other districts that weren't losing will be losing. I try to challenge and I'll call them the education professionals, whether they be superintendents or for that matter, even teachers and the teachers unions. You know, do they even talk to their colleagues in some of the wealthier districts about some of the challenges that they have in the poor districts? They don't even talk to each other, ladies and gentlemen. They need to engage one another, because if I'm an educational professional, I got into that job presumably because I wanted to make sure that children, not just the child in my district, but children across the state of Illinois receive adequate funding, receive an adequate education. It's a big conversation, and when we start to silo it, we're not getting anywhere. Somebody talked about, if these aren't your representatives, talking to your representatives, engage them a little bit. And this is not about whether or not you're for Senate Bill 16 or against it. Right now, the way we're doing it is jacked up. Right now, the way it is not right, it's not fair, it's not proper. So again, we have to engage people in a conversation and get them to at least recognize that what we're doing is not right. If we get to that point, then we can move beyond that and start talking about whether it's a Senate Bill 16, or if you've been studying this over the last couple of years, you're familiar with House Bill 750, Senate Bill 174, 2238. I forget all the different numbers, but again, those bills have been trying to figure out how to fix a problem in a system that is currently flawed.
Thank you so much.
So I just want all of you to engage in the conversation. This is my third time, Pastor.
This is your third close,
I didn't think it would be three. Engage in the conversation, think broadly about this, and let's start encouraging people to be a part of this dialogue, not alienating people based on some personal feelings that you may have.
Clap your hands for them. Thanks so much. So as we shift, and please understand, I have absolutely no need to be rude. Please don't misunderstand it. I'm just trying to keep us timely so that we'll be able to hear from the community. Amen? So that's all I'm trying to do. So I want to make sure that you understand that's what we're trying to move forward. So as we prepare ourselves to take questions, let me just kind of tell you how we're going to do this. I have my little iPhone 6. Don't hate all of you all who have Samsung. I got an iPhone. Amen. Want you all to understand, we're going to give everybody the same allotted time. I'm going to give you 45 seconds to ask your question. And then we're going to allow them an opportunity, a certain limited amount of time, to respond to it. Because at the end of the day, what we have in this room are individuals who are concerned. We have families who are concerned. We have communities being represented who are concerned. We have organizations who are concerned, regions that are concerned. And so we want to hear from as many people as we possibly can in the allotted time that is on this agenda. So we don't have the benefit tonight of redundancy. We would ask that everybody not piggyback off of your neighbor. If they already asked that question, allow that to represent what your concern is so that we can hear from the broader group of the constituents. Is that all right, everybody? All right, we want to respect everybody's time. As we open the floor, we're going to have a comment from our representative, Christian Mitchell. Now I ask all of you all who have a question, if you will come down this middle aisle. Let me tell you, we don't have the ability to take all of the questions, but if you represent a group, if you're representing a community, could you let one individual represent that group or that community so that we can hear from as many people as possible? Again, you have 45 seconds to provide your comment or your question, and then we're going to allow the folks that are on the panel just about 1 minute and 30 seconds to respond back. We want very specific questions, very specific responses to that, all right? And we're going to get as many as we can. I didn't set the time limit, so I want you all to understand I'm going to cut it off when we need to cut it off. But if you hear your neighbor who came before you, if they asked your question, please don't ask that question again. Ask another question so we can get as much out of the panel as we possibly can. Is that all right? Christian Mitchell.
Just a real quick comment. So I heard some people say, when they mentioned concern about how CPS is spending dollars in her district. Another piece of this bill gives us as a state General Assembly for the first time transparency into the inter-district spending of the Chicago public schools. So if we wonder why, given that the levy's the same, some schools on, say, the north side look different than some schools on the south side, we finally will have a window into how that looks in a way that we can inform public policy, such as to make sure that those dollars are going toward the schools that need them the most. So with that, I'll turn to Pastor Harris for questions.
Thank you so much. Please tell us your name and ask your question.
Okay. My name is Laura Morgan. I'm with the South Shore Community Action Council. My question is, you said, Representative Mitchell, that CPS wins over time. My question is when? Is it 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
The answer is immediately and over time. So immediately, based on the fact that Chicago's property values are declining relative to the rest of the state, that's a boost. Plus the funding that went in last year, you adjust that for inflation, CPS wins immediately. When I say over time, time, what I mean is, it is not an accident that in addition to working hard on this bill, I'm the chief sponsor in Springfield of the progressive income tax. And the reason why is because if the wealthy pay their fair share, we get additional revenue. That additional revenue should go toward our schools. Because we're calculating based on need and poverty, and because of how much of it there is in CPS, as those dollars go up, more of that money goes to Chicago Public Schools over time.
Thank you so much. Say your name, ask your question.
Good afternoon. My name is Francis Banks. I'm a co-leader for the Involved Seniors for Justice. And my question is, the state of Illinois has been underfunding public schools for decades and ranks at the bottom of the nation of the amount of funds that go towards public education. No other state in the country other than Illinois relies so heavily on property taxes, leading to the disparity that many school districts, including CPS, would continue to experience. And SB 16 would do nothing to change this. How do you justify this?
So I don't agree with that. I think that SB 16, what we're dealing with is general state aid. That is the money that comes to the state through the income tax, the sales tax, the corporate tax, whatever it is. That money now would be 90% subject to student need. And because of that, we will see more progressivity in the formula, which is why you have the weight for poverty, for special education, for ESL. So based on the way the bill is structured, now to be clear, there is more we can do on the revenue side. Representative Davis talked about it, loopholes, et cetera, but what we are doing is saying the way the state spends its money is going to be subject to the need of the students in a very new way and for the first time. So there's more to be done, but this bill is a meaningful step forward.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Next question. Say your name.
Hi, good evening. My name is Irena Jackson. In District 299, Chicago Public Schools have been shifted to a per-pupil funding, which has led to a significant cuts in funding throughout the district. Senate Bill 16 will continue this slashing of funds. The ultimate issue is the need for increased revenue overall to provide better investment opportunities and better education for the children throughout the state of Illinois. Isn't Senate Bill 16 just a bait and switch?
It's not, absolutely not a bait and switch, but I agree with everything you just said, which is why both me and the representative and Ken Duncan have all talked about revenue in this equation, which is why, as I said, it's not an accident, I'm sponsoring a transformative revenue solution for the state of Illinois. We have to do both and, but again, to avoid building our house on the sand, as I used in the analogy earlier, we have to fix the house first and continue to put more revenue in going forward.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Mr. Taylor, and I would like to know, one, that this bill seems like it's I don't want to say bait and switch, but it seems like it's going to try and do the symptom and not the cause. The cause is what Alderman Burns said. We have a system that doesn't direct the funds where it's supposed to go. And the way, if you go district versus local schools, you can get it like Chicago, where we have a very high income district up there and low income on the south side. If you take the money out the whole district, you just hurt all of the students on the south side in the low income, because they're not going to get the money if you take it out of there. And that's not just for our district, that's for the Waukegan districts, Zion, all up there. There are a lot of there are a lot of districts that do not distribute the money correctly, and this does nothing to address that.
So I disagree with that, and it goes back to the comment that I made at the beginning, and I'll let Will Davis jump in here as well, which is part of the inter-district issue that we have is I can't tell you how CPS spends their money inter-district. Under this bill, they would be required to share that information with us in such a way that it can inform the way we do public policy. And we are not taking money out of the system. We are making sure the system distributes that money more equitably toward the kids who need it the most. Representative?
I'd just like to add, sir, I appreciate what you just said. When dollars get to the district level, then it's up to that district to determine how they're distributed. So our objective is not necessarily to dictate how those districts spend the dollars that they get. Our objective is to try to provide at least those challenged districts more revenue. That's where, at least in the suburbs, I challenge the board members and the people in that community to attend board meetings, to talk to the board members about how they spend the money that they get. Again, I can't tell them how to spend it. I'm trying to increase it. Yes, you're right. And there needs to be more conversation about how it's spent, but that becomes more of a local conversation. Now, again, here in Chicago, it is a big conversation versus, you know, where I am in the suburbs. But in the suburbs, those local districts, meaning that those board members who have to have people show up to board meetings to determine how the dollars are spent.
10 seconds.
Our job is to get it there.
Thank you.
So, let me say this, so can you imagine if Chicago had a local school board? Elected school board, excuse me. Elected. Can you imagine?
Pass that law.
Thank you. Next question. Next question.
Hi, good evening. My name is Scott Witherspoon. I'm a community resident, and I have a question regarding the bill. So can you talk about highlights of the plan for transformational change as we think about down the road, and what assurances are in place to make sure that we're not just buying reform?
I'm not sure I understand your question, sir.
So you talked about your plan for transformational change. You just mentioned that a minute ago. Could you talk about what that means and kind of highlight a few key points of the transformational change as it relates to this?
I was referring to two things. One, I was referring to changing the way we fund our public schools and the way the state distributes general state aid, which I've talked about in my last couple answers. The other thing I was talking about is, so right now, when you talk about income tax in the state of Illinois, or tax burden in general, when you combine sales taxes, excise taxes, the pass-through tax on paying for a gallon of gas, your tax burden as a member of the middle class is twice as high as the top 1%. And that's absolutely wrong. So when I say transformational, I mean transforming our revenue system such that we ask those who have the most ability to pay to do more and do their fair share. So when I was saying that, that's what I was referring to, which is why, you know, I'm not only working on this bill, but also sponsoring the progressive income tax. Okay.
Thank you. Just want to make it clear, the young lady in the back, she will be our final question because I want to make sure that we fit in all of the individuals that are in the line you should be heard from. I got you.
My name is Leon Finney. I'm the pastor of Metropolitan Apostolic Community Church and the president of the Woodlawn Community Development Corporation. First, I'd like to commend this meeting. I think it's a very important effort to make sure that we are informed. The Woodlawn Community Development Corporation and its sister, TWO, were the ones who joined the Urban League in 2008 to bring the suit as it related to the disparity of allocation of funding for Chicago public schools. So towards that end, we are very much concerned and have been concerned about whether or not there's adequate funding for our public schools. Clearly, this is a moment for us to know one thing, and that is, will this formula immediately impact the revenue and or the resources that the Chicago public schools will get this year? Is that, I mean, it's so all over the ballpark.
It'd be the next fiscal year, but, you know, depending on how you look at the numbers, and I asked ISB ISB staff to rerun them, you're talking about an impact between 20 and 100. They're going to rerun them, I want to say the first week of November, so we'll know officially. But the answer is yes, immediate positive impact. And by the way, for those districts that would lose some funds, that would be phased in over 4 years. Did I answer your question? No. I'm not sure I understand.
My question was, will the schools lose money this year? That's the question.
Absolutely not.
Thank you.
Chicago Public Schools will not lose money this year.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next year, we're going forward.
David Hatch, the People's Lobby. I've been part of this education funding equity fight with Reverend Russell and others for 20 years, so I applaud the effort to bring equity to the funding system. My question is this: I know you mentioned the progressive income tax, which you're a sponsor of. There's also 2/3 of the corporations in Illinois pay no taxes. And I believe all the legislators here support HB 3927 to make them disclose whether they pay taxes, and HB 390 to close about $500 million in loopholes. What are the prospects for actually getting the revenue part of it that, in addition to the equity, helps begin to build the adequacy? What's the chances of your colleagues finally passing this corporate tax package this year?
I'm going to let Will answer this because he's actually the sponsor of 390, which I voted for last year.
Well, needless to say, it's tough. So for anybody who doesn't know, based on the distribution of members, House and Senate, it takes 60 votes to pass something out of the House, 30 votes to pass something out of the Senate. There are only 20 members of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. So even if all 20 of us, in the House that is, talking about the House, even if all 20 of us was supported, we still got to find 40 other votes somewhere. And there aren't enough of those votes that exist in suburban communities or even downstate communities, which means that we got to figure out how to get Republicans on board with something like that, which is going to be tough because many of their constituents are the corporate guys that represent the companies that we're trying to go after. Now, you've heard a lot of conversation recently about closing loopholes or taxes and things of that nature. We have a lot of companies in Illinois that benefit from the money that you all spend in them that don't pay Illinois taxes.
30 seconds.
To me, I won't say it's a no-brainer, but if you got a company that doesn't pay taxes, why are we not passing bills like House Bill 390 to address those kinds of issues? Foreign dividends, where they can take their money, park it overseas, and not have to pay taxes on it.
10 seconds.
To me, it's like I said, a kind of a no-brainer conversation, but I got to figure out how to get 60 people to support the effort. When we did bring the bill up on the House floor, it got 49 votes.
Thank you. Got to move on. Thank you. Next question.
First of all, the reason why we have half of these problems is because we don't have an elected representative school board. The people who sit on that school board do not represent parents and students in this district, so that's part of the problem. And that was changed downstate. So you all have an opportunity to fix that before you even start talking about SB 16. Let's get that elected school board fixed. My question is, I have a special needs student, and it looks like, according to SB 16, the reimbursement that they usually give for speech therapy, psychology, and all that, how are you all gonna make up for that money if you're saying we're going to get this one pot of money? And to me, it looks like it's an attack on tenured teachers, because at the end of the day, when you all give us this small bucket of money, we're going to have to take it and afford to. Mollison has already lost $296,000, which means we're going to lose 3 teachers in the next 2 weeks. Can y'all figure out how to fix that? So let's stop promoting bad policy, because that's what this is. Let's figure out how to fix it, and first change that school board that's downtown.
So I think you got a bunch of legislators up here who are sponsors of the elected school board, number one. Number two, with the special education funding, it is pretty clear, based on the presentation that I put out, that on average those numbers are going to stay level. And by the way, if there is a higher concentration of special ed students, there is a process by which you can ask for additional funding as a district, as a school. So that's in there. So the idea that special education funding is going to be cut is not accurate. It is not. It simply is not accurate. And Will, go ahead.
So ma'am, to your question about,
allow them to be
I mentioned about the house group that we're working on. There have been at least 3 meetings where we've heard from different constituency groups about special ed funding, and they've talked about some of the same things that you're talking about. So when I mentioned anomalies in the bill, where it seems like we should be doing more than the bill may appear that it's going to do, I should say, special ed is one of those categories that we are taking a very close look at, because I agree, those categorical areas, while a lot of them really benefit wealthier districts, we know that there are children in schools like CPS in districts that benefit from those dollars. So we don't want to negatively impact special education spending. But there are other people who are trying to impact special education spending currently with bills that don't benefit your children. So again, the objective of this is to figure out how to put more money out there, increase the available dollars through Senate Bill 16 plus adequacy and raising more revenue. So if we're able to raise more revenue, then we don't have to worry about cuts and things like special education spending.
Thank you so much. Next question.
Good evening. My name is Adorthus McDowell, community resident. Since the state does not provide adequate schools funding, it does not lessen the problems facing districts which lose state funds. Instead, SB 16 puts a further emphasis on local tax sources as the primary funding source for these communities. How do you justify advocating for legislation that fails to address the root causes of disparities in the state of Illinois? How do you justify pushing legislation which would harm 26 district constituents who you are charged to represent?
Oh, that one was political. So the answer is that that's just not true. It's just not true. And as I demonstrated by this presentation, there's an additional $2,000 that would go towards students in concentrated poverty, many of whom live in the 26th district. This bill gets us to a place where state dollars are going toward the kids that need them the most, as opposed to right now, where, as Alderman Burns said, you have a massive redistribution of wealth. So I appreciate the question, but we can talk more about this afterwards, but it's just not accurate based on the data that was just presented. But thank you.
So much. Thanks so much. Next question. Statement? Go ahead.
Thank you all for your time this evening. As a parent and an advocate for children and working with as a member for Stand for Children, I thank you all for the information that you all are giving to us. On a daily basis, I work with children with special needs, with children in honor society or honor classes. And with this bill, I hope that the children that are above average are able to continue to have the help that they need to stay above average. And those children that are not reaching that average, that us parents take the time out and tutor with them to get them where they need to be, that the funding is actually there so that we can get them to where they need to be. But I do thank you for your time. And with change, there's always pros and cons. And with everyone in the building tonight, I want you to know to look forward to what's coming. Look at the outcome, look at the bigger picture. If it's gonna really help our children, then maybe we should look into it. So thank you all for your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
My name is G2 Brown, and I do want to applaud you all for the sense of urgency, but there are some concerns. As you may know, districts around the country that have been more successful, such as in New Jersey with the Abbott decision, there was a structure in place to earmark funds to address the issues of overcrowded classrooms, after-school programming, things of that nature. And so it targeted poverty, and it produced revenue to address those issues. This bill doesn't seem to do that. What this bill seems to do is create a formula where you're creating a poverty weight, but the poverty weight is not sufficient to address the deficiency that's already inbred within how schools are funded in the state. So the problem is, here's the problem, there's collateral damage to this. So at a school like Beethoven or Mollison that just endured massive budget cuts, while they're going through per pupil funding, and then the amount of money that they get from the state is not sufficient to address their issues, then those schools are destabilized. And then just give me a second. What I got you, brother. And the other thing is we need a conversation. We don't need to come up here and just have 30 I mean, if we're taxpayers, we should be able to engage people around the issue. I'm asking a serious question, and I can't ask.
So here's the thing, G2. So
let me finish my sentence.
So I agree. Now let me just do this.
Everybody's been respectful. Let him finish his sentence, but after that, we're done. Go ahead.
I'll facilitate. I promise.
Yeah, please, yes, sir.
What my goal is to be fair to everybody. So if one of the colleagues, and again, I think I've been rather fair, so one of the colleagues in the line want to give your time, there you go. That's only fair. I want to be fair to everybody. That's fair. She said she'll give it up. Here we go. All right, so he just got 45 more seconds. Let's use it wisely. Here we go.
All right, so can I respond to an element of his question? So one, we'd have the highest poverty rate in the country. Two, here's the thing. So if CPS property tax dollars are freed up, then what happens is you've got more money for wraparound services, for after-school programs, for early childhood education, for supplemental nutrition to deal with some of the additional needs that students in poverty need, because you've got additional state resources coming that go above and beyond what we have right now. That's that 2,000 or so more per student. So use wisely and combine with the transparency that CPS would have to report to the state how they're spending the dollars, we can start to tweak and devise policy based on meeting some of those ancillary needs above and beyond what just happens in the schoolhouse. So I hear you, G2. I agree with what you're saying. What I'm saying is this bill is a meaningful step in that direction in a way that moves all of this stuff forward. So I appreciate
not if you have a school system where there's an agenda to create a portfolio school district. So
just so everybody know, his colleague gave him this time, so we've been fair.
So when schools If Beethoven is suffering from budget cuts and then they don't get the sufficient resources, they lose teachers, they lose programming, and then what Chicago Public Schools does, because their agenda is to privatize education, what they do is they begin to punish those schools so with punitive actions. And so if we're going to move a bill that's talking about equitable school funding, if we're going to move a bill that's talking about equitable school funding, then what we're raising is that there has to be concurrently things in place for revenue, and there has to be things in place to make sure that Chicago Public Schools will not target schools in our community. That's just accurate. And we need a conversation, not a forum as if we lab rats. If I pay taxes, I should have the right to come up and ask a question without being told I got 30 seconds to speak. And it has nothing to do with political alliances. I spent 20 years of my life working in schools in this neighborhood. I put my work in. So I got the right to ask a question.
I agree 100%.
Everybody agrees, but others have a right to ask questions as well. So again, G2, you know where my office is, you know my staff is here, so why don't you come and say hello, all right? And Will Davis wants to address that question as well. I've addressed
it. So we want to stay on target with the time.
So G2, November 18th, there will be a House hearing on this bill. Probably late afternoon. We haven't set a time. We know it's going to be on the 18th, 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I would strongly encourage you, and I think if anybody paid attention to the documents that were received on this, while you may not sign up for any of this, but it does say attend the November 18th legislative hearing in Springfield. So I encourage you to come down and testify in front of the committees about how you feel based on what you just said. Okay.
But this is our neighborhood.
I'm not saying it's not. I'm a visitor to your neighborhood. I got it. But as a chairperson, I'm just saying you want a forum or an opportunity. November 18th provides you with an opportunity to come and talk specifically about how you feel about the bill and the challenges with it. That's all.
Thank you. You gotta get out of here. All right, next question. Please, let's everybody please respect the individual on the floor. He's been respectful to everybody else. Let's make sure we respect everybody.
Hey, I'm Marlon, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. And as an advocate for Stand for Children, I do, it might not address all the issues that we have, but one thing I do hear is that it's not about just CPS. It's about my cousins that's up in Robbins and my cousins that's down in Dalton and the other districts, that these kids need help. The problem's not just here in Chicago, it's everywhere. It's not talking about bringing more funding, but it is talking about distributing the funding equally. And with that, my question is, if I bought a brand new Cadillac, should I come to you for gas money? I don't think nobody want to give gas money to anybody that's driving a brand new Cadillac. But if somebody got on the bus, maybe you'll give them 10 cents or something to get on that bus ride. These kids need that funding, man.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anybody want to respond? Okay, no question? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi.
Excuse me, everybody, please, let's be respectful.
My name is Rebecca. I'm actually here from New Jersey tonight to talk to you guys. So I'm here representing cities like Camden, Patterson, Newark, Trenton. You know, we saw the Abbott ruling that was supposed to be one of the most progressive rulings in our country since Brown versus Board of Ed, to be able to equalize education. What happened on top of that was that we saw education funding that wasn't just. Education funding that was not equal and looked very much like what we're seeing here today. And what ended up happening is it set up all of our districts, our poor, brown, and Latino communities, to be run by the state and then taken over by our charter. So here's my question. My question to you is, how do you keep your commitment to the black and brown community, to the communities in this city that are low income, to make sure that we do not get taken over by the charter system and privatized?
Great question. It's a great question.
Okay. Representative Duncan.
That's a very, very great question. Let's hear so that
it is another excellent question. And the beauty of this is, with us as legislators, we get to get educated by you. That's the benefit that I see. And so I incorporate, along with my colleagues, solutions on dealing with this mammoth issue. First off, if you know me, if you know some of my other colleagues up here, we don't just lay down and take for granted what folk give us, especially if it's going to have a negative impact on the black and brown communities in particular. Myself as the head of the House and Senate Black Caucus, everyone knows that, who lobbies and advocate down in Springfield. Now, this bill is not soup yet, and I think this is the first sort of lobby out here in the community before it passed. Now, it passed the Senate. It's stuck in rules right now. So there has to be some advocacy on the side of us as House members to make sure that we take the lead in pushing that forward. Sometimes, hold on one second.
Built in that it won't be there.
Just a second. And so what happens is we get excited when a bill passes. Let me tell you how this works. For those who may not be familiar, whatever goes on in the House has to go on in the Senate. Whatever goes on in the Senate has to go on in the House, and then it goes to the governor, and we know the governor can either sign the bill or veto it. This bill is about us making it the best bill that it possibly can be. Now, is it going to satisfy everybody? Absolutely not. And so this communication here, for us, for me in particular, is beneficial. But don't make assumptions that we are of, at least certainly myself, is of some ulterior agenda. I'm simply trying to make sure that poor communities in my district in Chicago, where you're sitting, from the Gold Coast to the Soul Coast, from Division LaSalle to 79th and Paxton, receives adequate funding. Now, we're going to figure this thing out when we talk to our other colleagues downstate who don't want to see no real progress for Chicago when it comes to educational funding distribution. So this is the start. But stay on message with us and educate us on this bill, but don't think that we're just going to lay down and sort of internalize something that's backwards for our particular community.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well,
what's your name?
Pastor, to the young lady's point, I am not a fan of charter schools. I don't know how anybody else feels about it in this room. So just based on the way I feel about charters, okay, based on the way that I feel about charters, that would be a very tough conversation for me to have if somebody wanted to make this so that charters have the ability to run rampant in the state of Illinois. We have some current laws in place, and I don't know how familiar you are with Illinois law, and just the same, I'm not that familiar with New Jersey law, so I don't know if local control is prevalent in New Jersey like it is here in the state of Illinois. But we have, again, where I am, I know there was a charter school that wanted to come out to the south suburbs, and the constituents out there didn't want it, and they beat it back. So, I mean, we have to give some credit to the people in the areas that we represent to make some decisions based on what they feel is best. And the charter school was Urban Prep. Urban Prep wanted to come to the south suburbs, and it was rejected in the south suburbs. So again, to me, this is not an effort, and I would not support an effort that was put in place to allow that kind of thing to happen. That's not what I signed on for. That's not what I think this bill is about. And to your point, if you feel that that is something that can creep in there, thank you very much for enlightening me, and we'll make sure and be vigilant that it doesn't happen.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Jariba Lee. I'm a community resident and a community member. According to the Illinois Council for Exceptional Children, so that's the organization that advocates for special ed children and is the largest international organization that advocates for special needs children, SB 16 would, quote, negatively impact students with disabilities, parents, and school staff to provide them the services because it would eliminate funding for direct services. Question, does SB 16 eliminate direct funding to special education? How do you address this disparity that SB 16 will cause, and how do you justify moving forward with something that would negatively impact children who are vulnerable in our schools?
So this is a question that's come up before. I think everybody heard it, but it's about special education. And the answer is, one, what we had on the board here. Two, Representative Davis has made it clear that on this issue there have been presentations to the committee. It's looking like in addition to dealing with the anomalous districts, there may be an amendment on this topic. But again, Representative Davis and myself and others have made it clear we're not going to move forward with a bill that's hurtful to special education students. So we've answered that. But Representative Duncan just said count me in that too. So there's your answer to the question.
It wasn't clear to me, that's why I asked.
She still has time, so she's...
It wasn't clear, so that's why I asked the question. So if you could.
Okay, well, but again, like I think we said that this bill, I think Ken put it in a way that he said it's not soup yet, ma'am. So again, we're talking about a bill that has passed one chamber. It has not passed both chambers and is waiting on the governor's desk for a signature. So the House still has work to do on it, which is why we appreciate comments like yours and others that are pointing out specific things in the bill based on what you hear from associations. And not that I don't know much about that association, but again, sometimes what I found that a lot of the associations are looking at is what they call the bottom line. So again, school board associations, superintendent groups, principal groups, they're simply saying, here's Senate Bill 16, my district loses, therefore I'm against it. And that's not going to move the conversation forward. If anything, it's going to mean that we're going to wind up with the same system we got. And so the idea here is to move a system forward that tries to do it better. So we hope, and I don't know who your rep is, I hope that you are communicating with your rep saying, you know, here's some challenges as it relates to special ed funding, so that when we have that discussion amongst members, that person, whoever your rep is or senator, can step forward and say, I talked to a constituent and she has some issues with special ed funding. I want to make sure that those issues are addressed.
Thank you.
I hope that you are doing that.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, I'm Jacqueline Glover. It's a threefold. One, early part of this year, I heard that, I saw that they had given like $600 and some odd million to schools up north to actually give them annex and things like that that they didn't ask for. Does this process eliminate things like that? If so, how? Second is, how can we hold a hearing here in Chicago? And third, if this bill is passed and it helps kids that are gifted and things like that, then that still puts us in a disadvantage as well. And if so, if not, then did I hear that wrong?
So run that down for me again. So the first question was about kind of the annex question, and to that I would just say, sorry, say again?
Yeah, there were like about there are a few schools up north that was given millions of dollars, and one school actually rejected it and said we didn't want to annex, we want to keep our playground. When you have schools here that do need that money, so how did they actually, decide that we're going to give them that money and not us or the schools that needed it?
So let me answer the last part of your question, then I'm going to give it to Representative Davis to do the first part. So your question was about special ed gifted learners. That's a weight of, I think, like 1%, and that's per student, as opposed to the 75% on poverty. So again, that was a give in the legislative process, but one that says, can we promote gifted students? But again, that is a microscopic weight compared to the highest in the nation poverty weight that we would have. So it's not, the balance is right on that. As for the question number one, Representative Davis wanted to answer it.
If I understand what you're saying correctly, ma'am, is we're talking about school consolidation?
It wasn't a consolidation. They were actually giving money to build them an addition, an annex. And then one school actually rejected it. They didn't even ask for the money. Improvement or an addition to their.
Well, one thing that I can assure you is that dollars just aren't always given. Now, again, I don't know specifically the district. Maybe you can give me some more information. I mean, they're.
I'm sorry, it was CPS. Yes.
So we're talking about CPS.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know anything about that.
Here's what we'll do on that question. I will have my staff look into this, see if we can get you an answer. That's going to be CPS rather than us, but we'll see what we can find.
That was in the 43rd ward. But please
apparently that was in the 43rd ward.
But please understand, ma'am, currently dollars that come from the state are given to the districts through formulas in a lot of cases, and then the district level decisions are made about how things are spent. They're not made at my level. They're not made with me. We have the formulas to push the money out, and then locally decisions are made. Now, if you're talking about an annexation, that's a little different because we're talking about capital dollars. Capital dollars are different than operational dollars from the state.
So this will eliminate.
Well, no, I don't know. I'm just trying to give some context to it.
I have to stop you. If you all want to if you have more questions, see them after. I got to be fair to everybody. Next question.
Thank you. My name is Ebony Carr, and I'm proud to say that I'm a resident of the city of Chicago and a proud resident of Bronzeville. I had the opportunity last year to take my autistic son down to Springfield to meet with Senator Raoul and Representative Mitchell. And I just want to talk about how I believe that Senate Bill 16 and where it's going to support my autistic son. I had my son in our neighborhood school. He was nonverbal at the time, and when I chose to enact my constitutional right to enroll my son into a charter school on the opposite side of town, where I knew that my son would receive extra benefits, where I could be available and participate in the classroom. And he has done exceptionally well. I'm proud to say that he was accepted into Disney 2 Magnet School this fall. And so I just want to speak, I want to hear from you where Senate Bill 16 will give equitable funding for charter schools in relationship to our neighborhood schools.
So this bill does not address charter school funding. For those who don't know, they're funded in a range between 75 and 125% of neighborhood schools, generally kind of on the lower end. But again, this bill doesn't address that specifically, but I just want to say congratulations, and it was really great to see you in Springfield, and really, that's really awesome for your son. Yes? Hold on, Will Davis has an answer as well.
Well, with regard to funding charter schools, there is a process. Now, the challenge that I have with charter schools is, and again, City of Chicago may be a little different conversation, but in the suburbs where I am, if a charter school, if they can reach out to the local district. If the local district rejects it, then they can appeal to the Charter School Commission. So that commission, who probably doesn't represent people that live in that community, can say, yes, we think that charter school should come online. If they're allowed to come online, let's say that the per pupil spending of that particular district is $5,000 per child. Whatever the 100% cost of educating a child in a charter school comes out of that $5,000, which means that the rest of the children are left with whatever's left to educate those children. So the funding issue is the challenge that I have with charter schools. I tried to balance that a little bit through some legislation, and I got called that I was against educating children. When I'm just trying to figure out how to level it off a little bit so that the local school district doesn't take as big a hit for the dollars that then will be taken and given to the charter school. And again, when I talk about their 100% cost, if that charter school is rejected by the local district, they can go find a building. If they're able to fund putting marble floors in that building, the Taj Mahal, whatever that cost is, that local school district has to pay for it, whatever it is. So that presents the challenge that I've had with charter schools, because the funding issue is just not balanced.
There is an immediate loss when I took my child from a regular neighborhood school to a charter school in equity.
So thank you so very much. Would you give all of the folks who had, yes ma'am. The hearing in Chicago.
The hearing on the 18th. Now, mind you, this is a hearing of the Substantive Committee and the Appropriations Committee. So the reason why it's in Springfield on the 18th, ma'am, is not to slight anybody, but veto session for us, which is when we go back to Springfield, starts on the 19th. So we thought to get the maximum participation from members on both committees would be to have it in Springfield, because everybody's coming to Springfield sometimes that night or the next morning. So we're trying to draw people in. The idea of having that same hearing in Chicago, I will propose that to my work group to see if that's something. I can't guarantee it, but I will at least propose that to the group, that we have a similar hearing in Chicago. Now, mind you, Chicago, but which means that it's going to be about CPS, and this is a bill bigger than CPS. So I just want to put that out there, that if you want it in Chicago, if all you want to talk about is CPS, then you're probably not going to get as much participation, because unfortunately, while I'm okay with that, some of the other members of the committee, and this is a statewide committee, may not be as concerned about what happens with CPS. They may not be, but I certainly will at least ask if that can happen.
Thank you. Would you clap your hands for all of our folks who asked questions and all of the folks who gave answers and responses. Thank you very much. Again, I apologize for the fact that we had to have some level of order. Now listen, I just want to share this with you all. I think this is very important. We should never, I'll wait until we have everybody's attention. We should absolutely never get angry when constituents get passionate. They have a right to be passionate. But we should be frustrated when a lack of order causes many of us who are not educated to these issues allow us to leave the room ignorant. And so that's what order does. It allows us to keep things in perspective. And then I also think we should have more of these conversations, because how many of you all in this room learned a lot tonight? Raise your hand if you learned a lot. That means this was not a waste of time. And so after we leave here, the work does not stop here. Actually, it began here for some of us who are now educated. And a lot of times when we are passionate, if we can hear more of your information as opposed to the emotion, many of us will probably feel the same exact way that you do. So that's why we try to keep order. And again, I want to thank everybody for respecting the process. I think you did a fantastic job. Let's give tonight a hand, because that's what I call a success. All right, for next steps, and we all got to get home. Many of you have been at work all day. We want to hear from Christian Mitchell, who's going to give us the next steps and the call to action. And after he is done, Reverend Jakes will come up, who is the pastor of West Point Baptist Church, and close us out with prayer. All right, clap your hands for Christian Mitchell one more time. Thanks for letting me be your facilitator tonight.
Thank you. Thanks again to Pastor Harris for not only this, but all that he does. I'll be pretty brief because I know we're all tired. The hearing in Springfield on November 18th is going to be crucial. We need to make sure that our elected officials hear from us how important this is. Now I want to be very clear. Now I can actually be very clear. This bill is going to continue to move through the process. We've got a fantastic committee that's considering amendments, but again, the status quo is not acceptable. As was demonstrated here, we have poor kids who are losing every single day, but we can do better. We've passed background checks in Springfield to increase the regulation of private handgun sales. We passed marriage equality. We have done big things, and we can continue to do them with the help of everyone in this room. So I believe there are probably sheets on either the tables on the way out or on your chairs where you can sign up for announcements, for action alerts, to come down to Springfield on the 18th. We need your support to get this done. So with that, I will say thank you all so much for your comments, for your questions. Anything else that you have questions on, please make sure we have your information, and my staff or someone, or myself personally, will get back to you. For now, I'm going to turn it over to the Reverend Bernard Jakes.
I had this prayer all prepared, but I don't want to offer a prayer. I prefer to offer to you tonight, as we get ready to leave this place, some words that were spoken by the late Dr. Howard Thurman. Dr. Howard Thurman, he said, don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. I sat there and I listened to all that our representative had to offer, as well as those who sit at the table, those who are quite passionate, who ask questions. The joy of all that has taken place on tonight is that it screams to the atmosphere that there are many of you who really do care about our children. Here's what my challenge would be as you leave this place. Let's just make sure that the challenge is really for the children and not our own self-serving interests. When we fight for our children, irrespective of whether they live in Chicago, whether they live in East St. Louis, because again, this is a state issue. When we rid ourselves and make it less about us and all about them, eventually they become the winners. Let's continue when we leave this place to challenge our elected officials, because it should make them better. But let's also challenge ourselves to make sure that we are not simply rattling off at the mouth, but not putting any power behind what we speak. I leave you with that on tonight, and that is my prayer. Amen.